She said 4 words. 4 words she had said 100 times before. Words so ordinary she did not even think about them as they left her mouth. Be careful, princess. I love you. And then she watched her 15-year-old daughter walk out the front door on a warm Sunday afternoon to buy a candy bar from the store down the road. She expected her back in 20 minutes. She never saw her alive again. This is the story of Christy Wessleman. A girl who was only just getting started. A killer who stayed free for 30 years. A mother who never once stopped looking. And a broken system that destroyed an innocent man while the real monster sat comfortably 150 miles away, living a quiet life, reading detective novels, and watching true crime on television. If you think you know how cold cases work, this one is about to change your mind. Like this video right now. Subscribe to Midnight Crime 247 and hit that notification bell so you never miss a case. We stay up so justice does not sleep. Now let us get into it. It is the summer of 1985. Glen Ellyn, Illinois. A quiet suburb sitting in DuPage County, west of Chicago. The kind of town families chose on purpose. Tree-lined streets. Neighbors who waved from driveways. Kids who stayed outside until the streetlights buzzed on and nobody panicked. DuPage County had one of the lowest crime rates in the entire state of Illinois. The worst thing that happened most summers was a stolen bicycle. There was no reason to be afraid here. No reason at all. Christy Wessleman was born on April 19, 1970. The youngest daughter in the Wessleman household. She grew up in the Valley View subdivision with her parents Sandy and Bob, her brothers Bill and Greg, and her older sister Susan. By the time she was 15 she had already figured out exactly who she was. At Glenbard South High School, while most freshmen were still memorizing locker combinations and surviving the first week, Christy was running for freshman class president. And she won. Not because she was the most popular girl in the building, but because people genuinely trusted her. Teachers leaned on her. Younger students looked up to her. She had already been selected to serve as sophomore class president the following year. She played volleyball. She played basketball. She was a reader. Her mother spent years trying to find the right words to describe her and kept coming back to the same 5. Vibrant. Spirited. Gifted. Amazing. And not done yet. That was the thing about Christy Wessleman that makes this story so hard to sit with. She was only just getting started. July 21, 1985 was a Sunday and it started the way the best summer days do, with no real plan. Sandy and Christy had spent the afternoon inside watching old movies. Nothing special. Just a mother and her youngest daughter with nowhere to be. Then Sandy wanted some candy. The Jewel supermarket was close. Just a short walk along the path that residents of Valley View had used for years, cutting through the neighborhood toward Butterfield Road. Kids made that trip constantly. It was so routine that nobody thought twice about it. Christy slipped on her sneakers, grabbed a little money, and said she would be right back. Before she stepped away, Sandy said those 4 words. Be careful, princess. I love you. She had no way of knowing that was the last thing she would ever say to her daughter. Inside the Jewel that Sunday, Christy was exactly herself. Relaxed. Easy. She stood in line, bought a candy bar and a can of soda, and walked back out into the warm July air. The checkout clerk knew her. He had seen her in that store dozens of times. He watched her leave and thought nothing of it because there was nothing to think. She was just a kid heading home. She was captured on the store surveillance camera that afternoon. Grainy footage the way everything looked in 1985. But enough to confirm she had been there, she had been fine, and then she had walked out that door. 20 minutes passed and Sandy was not concerned. Christy had probably run into a friend. Summer afternoons had a way of stretching. But then the light started to change. The golden afternoon shifted to amber, then orange, then something darker. Sandy turned on the porch light. Picked up the phone and started calling Christy's friends one by one. "Have you seen her? Is she with you?" Every answer came back the same. "No. We have not seen her today." Sandy put the phone down. Stood on the porch. The neighborhood kids had gone inside. The streetlights were flickering on. Her daughter still was not home. The family spent the next several hours searching. Driving slowly with windows down, calling her name into the dark, knocking on doors. The night got deeper. By 1:50 in the morning, Sandy Wessleman called the police. Officers arrived and built a timeline. They confirmed Christy had been at the Jewel around 4 in the afternoon, made her purchase, and left. Then the trail stopped. The search pushed through the rest of the night. Flashlights sweeping dark yards. Voices disappearing into silence. By morning there was still nothing. A new team took over at midday. One detective looked at the map, then looked at the field. A stretch of overgrown land between the Jewel and the subdivision that adults in cars never thought about because they never needed to. They drove around it. Kids did not drive. Kids walked. And every kid in Valley View knew the shortcut, the narrow dirt trail worn flat by years of sneakers cutting through that field. If Christy had taken the most direct path home, she had walked straight into it. The detective stepped off the pavement. The path was easy to follow at first, just a thin line through the brush. The July heat pressed down. Insects hummed in the goldenrod. He kept walking. Then something made him stop. A few yards off the left side of the trail, the sawgrass was pushed down in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. A small hidden hollow in the thicket, not visible from the path unless you were standing at exactly the right angle. He pushed through. And then the world went silent. There in the depression of the earth, where the goldenrod was matted flat against the ground, the search ended. He reached for his radio, hand shaking, and called for the tape. It was 11:15 in the morning. Christy was just a few yards from the path. The thicket had hidden her completely. The medical examiner's report confirmed she had been subjected to an unthinkable violation before her life was taken. The attacker had used extreme force and then, deliberately and calmly, used a shoelace. That detail stopped investigators cold. A shoelace does not appear at a crime scene by accident. It means the killer either came prepared, or he was composed enough in that moment to use what was available. Either way it pointed towards someone who did not panic. Someone who stayed controlled enough to finish it completely. This was not chaos. This was predation. A few feet from her body, half buried in the dirt, investigators found a candy bar. Half eaten. He had still been eating when he took her off that path. That single detail collapsed the distance between a case number and a human being in a way no official report ever could. Forensic specialists worked the scene for hours and found nothing usable. The hard summer ground had taken no footprints. No fibers. No foreign objects. What they did recover was biological material, sealed in an evidence kit and locked into storage. In 1985, DNA analysis existed only in research settings. There was no national database. No mechanism to take what was sitting in that kit and connect it to a living name. The science was not there yet. That sample would sit in storage for 15 years before the world caught up to it. Sandy gave investigators one more detail she would carry with her for decades. Christy had been wearing a ring. A small gold band. Size 4.5. Set with a single pearl that had a small chip in it. A family heirloom. It was not on her finger. It was not anywhere at the scene. The killer had taken it. Police made a deliberate decision to tell no one about the ring. They held it back as a filter, because a person who mentioned a small gold ring with a chipped pearl without being told about it first had knowledge that could only come from one place. Officers quietly began monitoring pawn shops across DuPage County. No one ever tried to sell it. What unnerved detectives most was not the violence. It was the silence. A family had been hosting a backyard barbecue just a few dozen yards from the hollow where Christy was found. They heard nothing unusual. A gas station sat 60 yards from the edge of the field. An employee worked a full shift. He heard nothing either. The attack had been completely and utterly silent. This was not impulsive. This was predatory. By the evening of July 22, 1985, DuPage County had a murder with no suspect, no witnesses, and no evidence that 1985 science could use. The killer had stepped back onto the pavement and walked away as quietly as he had come. 3 years passed. 3 years of tips that dissolved. 3 years of a family waiting by a phone that never rang with the right news. By 1988, DNA analysis was beginning to cross from laboratory science into actual criminal investigation. The databases were incomplete. The processing was slow. But for a case with no fingerprints and no physical trail, it represented something investigators had not had in years. A new angle. Detectives went back through every person ever considered a suspect and asked for a voluntary DNA sample. One by one the men agreed. One by one they were eliminated. And then detectives reached a name that had been on their radar since the very first week of the investigation. Dana Henry. 34 years old. His mother's backyard sat approximately 100 yards from the hollow in the sawgrass. 100 yards. That was the entirety of the original suspicion. Not a witness. Not a timeline. Just the bad luck of where his mother happened to live. He had denied involvement from the beginning and cooperated with early questioning. But when detectives came back and asked for a DNA sample, Dana Henry said no. To him it was a matter of principle. A man should not have to surrender his body to a system that already looked at him like a monster in order to prove he was not one. That line cost him everything. Police sought a court order. Henry appeared at the hearing and said exactly what he had been saying since 1985. He was innocent. He had never even met Christy Wessleman. The judge charged him with contempt of court. According to Henry, what followed was stripping, isolation, and sustained pressure designed to have exactly one outcome. He was held for days until he finally broke. His DNA did not match. Dana Henry had nothing to do with Christy Wessleman's murder. In every legal and biological sense he was an innocent man. But the damage had already been done in ways a lab result could never reach. The legal fees came to approximately $50,000. In the late 1980s that was a mortgage, and it was in fact his mortgage. He took it out to pay the lawyers and eventually lost the house entirely. Friends disappeared. Family members pulled away. In a tight community where everyone knew everyone, being publicly associated with a child's murder was enough to permanently alter how people saw him. Some never stopped believing he was guilty. The DNA result did not matter to them. Henry moved away and rebuilt what life he could from the pieces that remained. Decades later he described what those years had felt like in 2 sentences. "I have had 2 settings over the last 30 years, he said. Angry and depressed. He also said this about the night in that jail cell. They never read me my rights, so I guess I never had any. Not one person from the DuPage County Sheriff's Office ever apologized to Dana Henry. Not in 1988 when the DNA cleared him. Not in 2015 when the real killer was identified. Not in 2018 when that killer was sentenced. He had never even met Christy Wessleman. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "still here." Let us see who is truly following this story. Because what comes next is where this case goes from heartbreaking to absolutely infuriating. The 1990s arrived and the case file sat in a drawer. Tips came in occasionally. Detectives followed each one and watched it dissolve. Sandy did not leave. She kept the same phone number. She sat in the same rooms where she and Christy had planned to watch old movies that Sunday afternoon. To the neighbors it was just a house on a quiet street. To Sandy it was a lighthouse kept lit year after year, just in case the truth finally decided to come home. She called the sheriff's office. She asked if anything was new. In the year 2000, investigators submitted the DNA profile to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database built exactly for cases like this one. A profile with no name attached, scanning millions of entries every year. And every year it found nothing. It was a digital ghost looking for a match that did not exist in the system yet. In 2002, a former DuPage County State's attorney who had carried Christie's case as a professional wound for years pushed a new law through the Illinois legislature. From that point forward, any person convicted of a felony in Illinois was required to submit a DNA sample to the state database. He said directly that Christie's case had driven him to fight for it. A murder with a clean DNA profile sitting in CODIS catching nothing because the man responsible had never been entered into any system. It was a gun loaded quietly in 2002 and placed on a shelf. Nobody in that room knew whose name it would eventually fire. That information was still 13 years away. In 2011, Sandy made a decision. She stood at a press conference and released the detail investigators had protected for 26 years. The ring. The small gold band with the chipped pearl setting that had been on Christie's finger when she walked out the door and had never been seen again. She had kept it hidden deliberately. Now there was nothing left to protect it for. Every trail had gone cold. The ring was the last card left to play. Sandy stood at that podium. Then she stopped addressing the room and spoke directly to the man she had spent 26 years waiting to face. There is a man out there who thinks he got away with murder. A pause. Please help us take away his dream. He stole all of Christie's. 25 new leads came in. Every single one dissolved. After 2011 the silence returned like it had never left. Then on September 10, 2015, a computer at the DuPage County Crime Laboratory processed what looked like a routine database comparison. The profile that had been sitting in CODIS for 15 years stopped on something. A notification loaded on a screen. After 30 years the digital ghost had found its match. The name on the screen was Michael Ark Jones. 62 years old. Champaign, Illinois. 150 miles from Glen Ellyn. The team pulled up his file and found something that stopped them cold. Not because of what was in it. Because of what was not. His name had never appeared in the Christy Wessleman case. Not once. Not as a suspect, a witness, a neighbor, or a name mentioned in passing by anyone the investigation had ever touched. In 30 years of tips, leads, and dead ends, Michael Ark Jones had never surfaced. He had been completely and perfectly invisible. Here is how his DNA ended up in the system. In July of 2015, Jones had been arrested in Champaign County for aggravated domestic battery. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation. And under the Illinois law passed in 2002, the law inspired directly by Christie's unsolved murder, he was required to submit a DNA sample. He handed it over without resistance. He had no reason to believe it would connect him to anything. The sample was processed. The system ran its comparison on September 10, 2015. And it matched the profile that had been waiting since the year 2000. The gun loaded in 2002 had finally fired. Investigators did not call Sandy Wessleman. They boarded a plane to Colorado, where she had been living, and knocked on her door in person. Because after 30 years of phone calls with no answers, the answer deserved to arrive differently. They told her they had a match. They told her they had a name. Her son Bill put his reaction into one sentence. My initial reaction is one of shock and awe. We have been waiting for news like this for 30 years, and it finally came. What the investigators then found when they pulled back the curtain on Jones's life was not a monster hiding behind an elaborate disguise. It was something more disturbing. An ordinary-looking life built directly on top of a pattern of violence the system had been given every opportunity to stop. Michael Jones had first come to the attention of law enforcement in 1976 when he targeted a woman named Judith Van Kirk. The case did not end in a conviction. Years later, standing outside a courthouse after the sentencing, she introduced herself in a single sentence. I was Michael Jones's first victim. Not his first known victim. His first. The one who existed before the records, before anyone was paying attention. A year later in 1977, he escalated in a way that removed any doubt about his nature. A young woman named Jerry Michael was riding her bicycle on the northwest side of Chicago when Jones drove his car directly into her, knocked her to the ground, forced her into his residence under the threat of a weapon, and committed a series of violations that would scar her life permanently. He was convicted. Sentenced to 10 to 20 years. The state gave him 6. The gates opened in 1983. Jerry Michael found out he was free the way victims so often find out, after the fact, when nothing could be undone. Had he served at least the 10 years, she said at the 2018 sentencing, her voice level and precise, we would not be here today for this. Jones walked out in 1983 on parole. 2 years later on a warm Sunday afternoon in July 1985 he was in the area of Glen Ellyn. He was still on parole for what he had done to Jerry Michael when he followed Christy into that field. Here is something other channels did not tell you. Investigators examining the full sweep of Jones's history, his solo travel patterns, his methodology, his decades of controlled behavior between offenses, and his obsessive study of forensic investigation, quietly examined whether Christy Wessleman was his only victim. The pattern of someone who plans, executes with no witnesses, leaves no physical trace, and returns to ordinary life for years at a time does not typically belong to someone who acted only once. Law enforcement in Illinois and neighboring states reviewed unsolved cases from the late 1970s through the mid-1990s that shared similarities in method and geography. No additional charges were ever filed. But that review happening at all tells you something important about what investigators privately believed about the man they were looking at. There is also the matter of the ring. The small gold band with the chipped pearl that Sandy Wessleman described at that 2011 press conference has never been recovered. Jones was asked about it. He denied everything. It was not found in any search of his properties. What he did with it remains unknown to this day. Sandy Wessleman never got it back. That absence is its own kind of cruelty. In the 30 years between 1985 and 2015, Jones had married. His first wife eventually left him and obtained a restraining order, the reason being an obsessive and inappropriate interest he had developed in one of her young relatives. No charges followed. In 1999 he was arrested again for assaulting a family member of a subsequent girlfriend. He had lived in Champaign for decades, described by neighbors as quiet and unremarkable. He had also been obsessed, according to people close to him, with detective novels and true crime television. He was not just a killer. He was a student of the craft. He sat in his quiet Champaign home, reading about forensic mistakes, perhaps comfortable in the knowledge of an evidence kit. Sitting in a DuPage County storage room that had spent 30 years with nothing to say. What he did not know was that a law passed in 2002 had been waiting specifically for a moment exactly like his July 2015 arrest. He had been careful for 30 years. One domestic dispute ended all of it. On September 21, 2015, Michael R. Jones was arrested and taken to the DuPage County Jail. Held without bail. When investigators sat across from him and showed him a photograph of Christy Wessleman, Jones looked at the image and delivered his answer without hesitation. "As God is my witness, I have never seen her before." Flat. Practiced. A denial delivered by a man who had spent 30 years living as though that Sunday afternoon had never happened. The DNA said otherwise. The DNA does not negotiate with a man's version of himself. His attorneys challenged the evidence and built a defense around the integrity of the testing process. The family waited again. 3 more years added on to 30 years. Then on January 18, 2018, Michael Jones appeared before Judge George Babuz and entered a guilty plea to 1 count of murder. He had been scheduled for trial that same day. He chose at the last possible moment to spare himself full exposure in exchange for a sentencing recommendation he could live with. 5 days later, on January 23, 2018, they gathered in Wheaton for the sentencing. Sandy Wessleman was 78 years old. She walked into that courtroom carrying a photograph of her daughter. When the moment came for her to speak, she stood and delivered an 11-minute victim impact statement she had waited 33 years to give. She glanced at Jones only once. She did not speak to him. She spoke about Christy. Christy was murdered on July 21, 1985, she said. We were denied our right to see what the final results of her journey would have been. She described what Christy had missed, not as a list of milestones but as a series of moments that had happened to everyone around her and never to her. Christy did not have the chance to go to her brother's or sister's weddings. She never knew the joy of getting to know her nieces and nephews. A pause. What she would have become will forever be an unfinished book. That phrase landed in that courtroom and stayed there. An unfinished book. It was not just grief speaking. It was a mother who had spent 33 years watching the story her daughter should have been living play out in the lives of everyone around her while Christy's own pages stayed blank. Judith Van Kirk was in that courtroom. Jerry Michael was in that courtroom. 2 women who had survived Michael Jones before Christy sat in the same room as the man who had moved through their lives like a slow, patient catastrophe. Jones sat at the defense table throughout all of it. He said nothing. Not a word. Not an acknowledgement. Not a single sentence directed at the people whose lives he had permanently altered. Judge George Babuz delivered the sentence. 80 years. Parole eligible no earlier than 2065. At the age of 64, the judge said, this is essentially a life sentence. Based on his conduct, the defendant has earned each and every day of his sentence. Jones would need to be over 140 years old before he was eligible for release. He will die in prison. That is not speculation. That is arithmetic. There was one more person in that courtroom who deserves to be named. Dana Henry had driven to Wheaton to watch the sentencing of the man whose crime had been used to destroy him. He had lost his house, his money, his relationships, and in many ways the version of himself that had existed before 1988. He came hoping that watching the real killer receive justice would give him something back. It did not. The verdict had not returned what had been taken. The sentence had not restored a single year of the life dismantled by a system that was supposed to find the truth. I have had 2 settings over the last 30 years, he had once said. Angry and depressed. Standing outside that courthouse in January 2018, with the real killer finally behind bars, the setting had not changed. Not one person from the DuPage County Sheriff's Office ever apologized to Dana Henry. Across 30 years and every development in this case, no one in an official capacity ever acknowledged what had been done to him. He had never even met Christy Wessleman. After the sentencing, Christy's former classmates came together to do something. They reinstated the Christina Wessleman Memorial Scholarship at Glenbard South High School. The scholarship is awarded every single year to the student who serves as freshman class president. The same role Christy had held. The same role that had already been waiting for her sophomore year when she walked out that door and never came home. Because while Michael Jones spent 30 years believing he had erased a 15-year-old girl from the story of DuPage County, Christy's name was being carried forward quietly and persistently by the people who had loved her. He took her life. He did not take her legacy. Every year a new student at Glenbard South steps into a leadership role and carries her name into a future that Christy was never allowed to have. That is what he could not touch. That is what survived him. Sandy Wessleman watched her daughter walk out a front door on a Sunday afternoon in 1985 and said 4 words she had no way of knowing would be the last. Michael Jones took 30 years, 1 domestic dispute, and a law inspired directly by Christy's own unsolved murder to finally face what he had done. But here is what 30 years could not change. Christy Wessleman was vibrant and spirited and gifted and amazing. A class president at 15 with a trajectory that pointed somewhere significant. A girl who loved old movies and volleyball and her family and a Sunday afternoon with nowhere to be. She was not just a case number in a DuPage County file. She was an unfinished book. And the people who loved her have never stopped reading. If this story moved you, share this video right now. Not for the algorithm. For Christy. For every family still sitting by a phone waiting for an answer that is 30 years overdue. Drop a comment telling me which part of this case you cannot stop thinking about. Is it the 30 years of silence? Dana Henry losing everything for a crime he never committed? Sandy Wessleman standing at that podium asking a killer to give her daughter's dream back? Tell me below. Subscribe to Midnight Crime 247 if you are not already here, turn on notifications, and stay close because the next case we are covering is just as haunting as this one. We do not stop until the truth is out. See you on the next one.